Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Detroit Institute of Arts Thursdays at the Museum program. I am Christine Mark. I am the manager of volunteer development for the DIA. Today, we have a brand new virtual tour for you, and we will be exploring the treasures in our German Expressionism collection. These works were created by artists throughout Germany in the early 20th century and focus on mankind's spiritual connection to the world. During the program, I will be taking your questions and moderating the Q&A. So to ask a question, you can leave a comment on the Facebook page post, or you can leave a public comment on our YouTube page. Be sure to log into your YouTube account using your Gmail. Our veteran host, Ray Henney, is joined today by the newest member of our team, Gabby Sandermeyer, who has been an IPV at the DIA for 5 years and serves on the IPV board as the chair of communications. Gabby, in her daily life, is a German teacher at the Detroit Waldorf School, where she teaches grades 1 through 8. Gabby was born in Soest, Germany, which is an old medieval town whose beauty was recognized by great painters throughout time. So let's all welcome our newest member, Gabby, to the team. And Ray Henney, you'll be starting us off today. So welcome.
Gabby, I'm thrilled to have you here, and I'm really thrilled about what we're about to present.
Yeah, thank you, Ray. I'm thrilled too.
Yeah, well, the DIA does have an extensive collection of German Expressionist art and is considered to be one of the finest, if not the finest, compilation of such art outside of Germany. Founded in the 20th century, German Expressionism, like other art movements in Europe and the United States, reacted to the intense and consuming quality of the industrialization and commercialization of modern Western societies from agricultural communities. Industry created jobs, but also difficult working conditions and the destruction of the environment. Commercialism valued money and possessions over heritage and traditional values and ethical standards. German Expressionism is less a unified style than an attitude and a shared state of mind critical of modern life and probing humanity's spiritual condition and the potential harmony with nature, as Christine was just mentioning. In a sense, their philosophy was that modern life was destroying our basic humanity, and that returning to and reflecting on nature and humans' connection to nature would restore our essential selves. In order to explore the spiritual and the emotional, these artists employed the expressionist method of painting, which is partially inspired by such artists as Van Gogh. Can we have the first slide? Thank you. This is a famous Van Gogh painting in the DIA's collection, and it provides an example of the inspiration to Expressionism. Expressionism is a style that seeks to express the inner world of emotion rather than reproduce external reality. It is characterized by the use of shapes, broad brushstrokes, and bold colors. For those of us who value painting reflecting what we see, kindly suspend that urge and allow yourself to see through the emotional and the spiritual. While the German Expressionists, within the German Expressionists, there were two different groups. Next slide, please. The first was called the Bridge, or Die Brücke, founded in 1905 in Dresden, which pursued inward searching in the quest for a new life and social change. This is a very famous painting in the DIA's collection that was done by a Die Brücke artist, Ernst Kirchner, that Gabby will be speaking about shortly. Next slide, please. The second group was called the Blue Rider, or Der Blue Ritter, founded in 1911 in Munich. This group focused solely on man's relationship with the innermost secrets of nature and spirituality. This is another famous painting in the DIA's collection done by a Der Blue Ritter artist, Franz Mark, which Gabby will also be discussing in just a moment. While each of these groups' philosophical philosophy focused slightly different on different aspects of life, they shared the same artistic aspirations concerning the rejection of industry and commercialism in favor of the primacy of nature and humanity's essential self. The German Expressionist movement generally is considered to have begun in 1905 and ended in 1933 when the National Socialist Party, commonly referred to as the Nazi Party, took power and engaged in a frantic campaign of vilifying all forms of modern art, including German Expressionism. In 1937, the Nazi Party had confiscated over 17,000 sculptures, paintings, prints, and drawings. Next slide, please. In July 1937, the Nazi Party displayed many of these pieces in an exhibition designed to subject this art to public ridicule. The event was called the Degenerate Art Exhibition. And you can see to the left a photo of the exhibition, and to the right some pages from the catalog. Next slide, please. This is a wood print of Wilhelm Valentiner, director of the DIA, from 1924 to 1945. Valentiner, who was German, knew many of the German Expressionist artists and had the museum purchase their art directly from the artist or the artist's representative. Valentiner also encouraged Detroit collectors to purchase German Expressionist art. This particular work was done by a German Expressionist artist, Carl Schmidt Rutloff, who we'll be discussing later and knew Valentiner very well. Now, these acquisitions of German Expressionist art by the DIA was not universally popular at the time because German Expressionism was considered by many to be harsh, avant-garde art. And there was still a general anti-German sentiment after World War I in the United States and parts of Europe. But nonetheless, Detroit became a safe haven, and the DIA was able to obtain some of the finest examples of German Expressionist art. Indeed, many prominent European and American museums envy the DIA's collection. Gabby, you want to start us off?
Yeah, thank you, Ray. Yeah, what we see here is the Avenger, a sculpture by Ernst Barlach, and this dates to 1914. So it represents Barlach's response to the outbreak of the First World War in August of 1914. And if we look at it, the sculpture clearly is wider than tall, and so it has a really strong horizontal orientation. I can show you exactly how tall and how long it is. So it is 24 inches long. So can you see that? No, I have to. So it is this long and, hold on, 18 inches tall. So it is pretty massive, right? So we see the slanted base of it, and we see the rope, how it blows back in diagonal folds. It's almost like a fan. And so in spite of the sculpture being so compact and obviously heavy, so it really expresses a very strong motion, like a strong forward movement that really stands out to the viewer. And the Avenger really rises a sword ready to strike. So it's really the dramatic gesture of unrestrained aggression. So although this sculpture was connected to the outbreak of the First World War, at first Barlach referred to it in his diary. So he was really always keeping a diary and writing letters. So we know a lot of about him and about his thoughts. So he referred to it as der Berserker, the Berserk. It's a fanatic Nordic warrior. So he writes, the Berserk for me is a crystallized war, a storm overcoming all hindrances. He writes that 3 weeks into the First World War, so beginning of September 1914. So about Barlach, he was born in the far north in Germany in 1870. He settled in Güstrow, and that is a small town close to Rostock in the northeast of Germany. So he was not only a sculptor and graphic artist, he was also a gifted playwright and novelist. So at first, Barlach was an enthusiastic supporter of the First World War, like, frankly, many other artists, intellectuals in Germany and all over Europe, really, also in Britain, France, and Italy. So they all believed that a new dynamic society could be forged through the war. They saw it as like a cathartic experience. Barlach joined the troops in 1915, and the war did become a turning point for him, yet, for different reasons. He was appalled by his war experience at the front and then turned into a staunch pacifist, really overwhelmed by the pity of war. Barlach responded to this experience in his art, and from now on, really pacifism became the shaping influence for his sculpture. Consequently, he rededicated or reinterpreted the Avenger in his diary. Again, he was writing as a symbol for the destructive forces that continued even after the war, seeking revenge and retribution. So, Barlach's work, he was very famous and very well known in Germany in the 1920s. But he was not really appreciated, of course, by Hitler and the Nazi regime. So 2 of his works were included in the 1937 exhibition of degenerate art in Munich, that Ray mentioned. Now, of course, he's considered one of the most important German artists. But he did spend the last years of his life in artistic isolation. He died in 1938 at 68 years old. Thank you, Christine. Are there any questions? Oh, I should mention this real quick. Thank you, Kimi, for bringing the slide. This is another artwork of Barlach, and it's probably his most famous, and it's very significant, I feel. So that is the hovering angel. He made it for the cathedral in Güstrow. And as I said, he was not appreciated by the Nazis, so it was removed, and the metal was melted down to make weapons out of it. Luckily, he had good friends, so there was still a model left, and they could recast this artwork, and now it is to be found in Güstrow, in the cathedral, and in a church in Cologne, and I hope to see it soon. So, thank you.
Any questions, Christine?
Yeah, is it still in its original spot then, Gabby?
It is. So it is a second cast, but it is in its original spot, yes.
Okay, thank you. You have a few expressions here of people who are already loving the talk. So thank you.
That's great.
Ray, I think you're up.
Okay, yeah. Next slide, please. This is Max Beckmann and his self-portrait, which is in the same gallery as the sculpture that Gabby was talking about. Indeed, every piece that we are discussing today is up in the German Expressionist gallery, which is in the modern wing of the DIA. So if you have a chance to go see it, you'll be able to see everything that we're discussing today. So this is Max Beckmann. Max's photo is to the right. He was educated at the traditional German Art Academy, and he began his artistic career dedicated to the classical and mainstream painting, including faithful objective rendering to nature. He admired the painters, the masters of the Renaissance and Neoclassicism. He particularly liked large-scale renderings of biblical and literal themes. After the break of World War I, he enlisted in the medical corps, but the carnage and trauma he witnessed caused him to suffer a complete physical and mental breakdown within a year. After his discharge, Beckmann settled in Frankfurt, where he abandoned this classical romantic style of painting in favor of simplicity and directness. He began to violently distort figures and perspectives. Beckmann experimented with methods of communication to explore the human predicament in a symbolic and universal ways. In 1933, the Nazi Party dismissed him from his professorship at Frankfurt, and he left Germany for good in July 1937, a week before the Degenerate Art exhibition was to open. He lived in Amsterdam until 1947, when Perry T. Rathbone, who was the director of the St. Louis Art Museum, encouraged Beckmann to come to the United States and take a teaching position at the University of Washington University in St. Louis. Rathbone's previous position was at the DIA, where he worked closely with the DIA's director, William Valentiner. So it's highly likely that Valentiner inspired Rathbone's acute interest in German Expressionism. Indeed, the St. Louis Art Museum has one of the largest collections of German Expressionism outside Germany. So you can see the effect, the ripple effect that Valentiner had on the collection of German Expressionism art in the United States. Later, Beckmann took a position at the Brooklyn Museum School of Art, and he died of a massive heart attack in 1950 while taking his daily stroll through Central Park. Next slide, please. This is still life with fallen candles. It's about 30 inches tall and 31 inches wide. Shortly after Beckmann finished this painting in 1929, Valentiner had the director buy it directly from the artist. It became the first Beckmann painting to be acquired by an American museum. Beckmann favored the motif of lit and fallen candles because of their symbolism. Next slide, Kimmy. Inspired by his formal training, Beckmann used candles to recall the symbolism of 17th century Dutch still life paintings, such as this one in the DIA's collection. It's a reminder of the fleeting nature of human existence. The candle consumes itself to shed light. Notice in this painting the various symbolisms of human mortality, including the candle that has almost lost all its light. Next slide. For Beckmann, candles also symbolize man's desire to see and their inability to do so, caused by either spiritual blindness or oppression produced by modern industrial, commercial, and authoritarian societies. Note that the painting lacks perspective. It appears flat or two-dimensional. Next slide, please. At the turn of the century, many avant-garde movements adopted this style of exploring flatness or two-dimensionalness of a canvas, which some scholars have credited to the influence of post-impressionist painter Paul Cézanne. This Cézanne painting in the DIA's collection provides an example of his flattening of the perspective in the two-dimensionalness of the canvas. Next slide, Kimmy. Beckmann endowed this still life with a human sense of sadness. Two candles are toppled over and snuffed out in their prime, their weight resting on fragile fruit, pears and grapes. Fruit also is a traditional symbol of the insurmountable temporal condition of living and as time quickly causes decay. Two candles in the background seem to be mournful observers, trying in vain to illuminate the scene. Notice the candle standing on the right hardly has light. The light, though, comes from harsh daylight from above, which creates deep, dark shadows. Beckmann contributes to this melancholy mood by painting large parts of deep black, emphasizing the void of the human condition. Next slide, please. This is the self-portrait that we saw a moment ago. Beckmann named it Self-Portrait in Olive and Brown. This was painted after World War II, when Beckmann was 61 years old and had experienced the horrors of World War I and World War II in prosecution by the Nazi Party. Next slide, please. Interestingly, Cézanne, who was such an influence on Beckmann, had also done several self-portraits with a canvas, such as this drawing, which is in the DIA's collection. Next slide, please. Beckmann did many self-portraits to search for his inner self. He used colors and features to illustrate emotions. Notice Beckmann's appearance, unsmiling, plainly dressed, and nearby the canvas. he seems close physically to us, and spaces are pressed in and around the figure. The composition has this claustrophobic sense. But Beckmann gazes out from behind the canvas, as if it were a shield. His gaze is at once challenging, but also distant. Is this meant to convey a strong persona that is masking his vulnerability? Is he showing defiance or disdain or some other deep personal emotion? Christine, any questions?
Not at this time, Ray.
Okay, thanks. Gabby?
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, this magnificent painting is Winter Landscape in Moonlight by Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, and it dates to 1919, so 1 year after the First World War ended. So Kirchner, too, was an avid letter writer, and he was in constant contact with his friends. And that is why we can really pinpoint the moment when he got the idea for this painting. So, and I will make an excerpt from a letter where he mentioned this to like the center of this little talk about the winter landscape. So I quote from his letter, and he wrote it on the 20th of January in 1919. And in this letter, he expresses his relief that he's not in Berlin, but in the serene Swiss Alps instead. So he writes, people are half mad there. Amidst machine gun fire and invasions, they are partying and dancing. So, real quick, I stop here for a moment. Raymond, have you seen the show Babylon Berlin?
It's on Netflix. And I understand it's gotten a lot of critical acclaim.
It did, and it gives you a great glimpse into the life in post-war Germany. So I really recommend it. It's not always easy to watch, but super exciting and great. So it gives you, so people were really dancing on the volcano, so to say, you know, and so to look at the year 1919, so historians argue really that the 19th century did not end in 1899, so it rather ended, they say, in 1918 with the end of the First World War. So it is certainly true for Germany. So in spite of a rich history of the region itself, you know, Germany as a nation state was a fairly young construction. So it had been founded only in 1871. At a time, you know, when the Prussian king had been set in place as a German emperor. So emperor, it sounds like a huge and long tradition, right? But it was not even 50 years old at the time that it ended. So emperor. So in November of 1918, after the First World War, Wilhelm II had abdicated. And now in 1919, the country was in the midst of founding the Weimar Republic, a democratic form of government, and everything, you know, was in flux, so to say. The old world that people knew was gone. So I think that is really what Kirchner describes here for us when he mentions the machine gun fire and the partying and dancing at the same time. So back to his letter. He continues, while here there was such a wonderful moonset early this morning. The yellow moon on small pink clouds and the mountains a pure deep blue, completely magnificent. I would have so gladly painted it. And here, you know, he already speaks about this painting, not yet executed, but present in his mind. And he himself, you know, points out one of the major characteristics of the expressionist art, you know, the bold colors. So he loved to use the three primary colors, yellow, red, and blue. And with these, he creates this calm, peaceful, and serene landscape, really, which, you know, at the same time is, you know, somewhat dramatic. You know, look at all that red. So the pointy forms and the sharp lines certainly contribute to the drama of it. And, you know, looking at Kirchner and his personality, I'm tempted to say that only a tormented soul can see it that way. So in his letter, Kirchner continues, "But cold it was. Even my windows were frozen, though I had a fire all night." And, just recently, a friend of mine, we visited the gallery. We're standing in front of that painting thinking, what is it with the clouds? And I really think that with the clouds, he is expressing, the cold. It's all this crystallized form. And in a way, they almost remind me to these, frosty flowers that, ice is painting on the windows. If one should have not like double paint windows. So I think it's really, it's showing us the coldness of that night. So so this excerpt ends with him saying, "Yet how eternally happy I am to be here and to receive only the last splashes of the waves of outside life through the mail." And so I think with this passage becomes clear once more, how the Swiss Alps are an escape for Kirchner. But, not completely so. The waves of outside life, still impact him. And of course, there was also his war trauma that he was escaping from. So how did he get here, from Berlin to the Swiss Alps, close to Davos, which you may know as a fancy ski resort? So at the outbreak of the First World War in August 1914, he volunteered for service, and soon he experienced a total physical and mental breakdown and was discharged. Thank you for that slide. We don't have that at the museum. It is in Oberlin College, and we see Kirchner, and he's painting self-portrait of a soldier. Mind you, he was a driver, he was never injured. He did not lose his hand. So, but it, shows you really how he felt about this experience. So to recover from his trauma, he went to a sanatorium in Switzerland and then decided to stay there. So it was in general like a place where people would go for physical and mental relief. So the Nazis, to fast forward, the Nazis did not appreciate his art. He was deemed un-German, degenerate, and they raided, as you know, museums and private collections. From Kirchner alone, he lost close to 700 paintings of his that were exhibited in public museum. Looking at Detroit, William Valentina supported Kirchner. He was in 1937, at the time of the exhibition, he was the director of the museum, and he encouraged private collectors to buy German Expressionist art and also, Kirchner. And he even organized a private, like a solo show for Kirchner at the DIA. Nonetheless, Kirchner did not get over his, wartime experience, over the loss of his paintings. He took his own life in 1938, 58 years old. Christine, are there any questions?
Gabby, one of our viewers is thinking about having hot chocolate in those mountains. So
I bet he did.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful painting, and it's featured in the gallery in the center. So it's just breathtaking. Gabby, I'm sure you've had the experience of when you're doing tours, people just staring at this painting. It really is captivating.
And it is fairly huge, so I could show you again, but my little window here
you won't be able to see
it justice.
I don't think it'll fit, Gabby.
No, it's a wonderful. It's really considered one of the German Expressionist masterpieces, and we're very fortunate to have it here.
We are.
Should we go to the next one? Oh, I'm sorry, Christine, go ahead.
Oh, I just was going to mention when the new museum in New York City did a They recreated the Degenerate Art Show from 1937 in Munich, and they recreated it some years ago. And the DIA, we loaned this painting to the museum in New York City, as this was one of the paintings displayed in the original Degenerate Art Show.
Okay, this is Carl Schmidt Rutloff. He was born Carl Schmidt in Rutloff, Germany in 1884. And he later met the artist Erich Heckel, who would also become a German Expressionist painter. In 1901, Rutloff followed him to Dresden. He was still Carl Schmidt at the time. He followed Heckel to Dresden to study architecture. Then Heckel introduced Schmidt to Ernest Kirchner, who Gabby was just talking about, who was also studying architecture at the time. They all soon abandoned architecture in favor of painting. Schmidt, Kirchner, Heckel, and others founded the Bridge movement, which I had mentioned before. Schmidt then changed his name by adding Rutloff to it, which is where he was born. And that is similar to Renaissance painters, who had the location of their birth in their names. For Rutloff, it signaled a beginning, a new beginning to his own life. Over time, Rutloff developed his own personal style, paintings with pictorial order and a feeling of structure, which translated into rigorous, simplified forms and bold planes of color. Rutloff's compositions were infused with raw strength. In 1914, he explained his art to an editor of a publication as follows, quote, "I have no program, only the inexplicable yearning to grasp what I see and feel." End of quote. Unfortunately, like almost every artist that we were going to discuss, Rutloff suffered prosecution by the Nazi Party, including the confiscation of almost 650 of his works and the inclusion of 51 of those works in the Degenerate Art Exhibition. Next slide, please. This is an iconic German Expressionist painting in the DIA's collection and is currently up. It's called Evening by the Sea. It's rather large. It's 3.5 feet tall and nearly 4 feet wide. During the period of the early 1900s through the 1960s, Rutloff traveled to the northern European seacoast every summer because he found inspiration in the austere beauty of the seashore. He painted this work during the summer and early fall of 1919 at a remote village on the Baltic. It epitomizes the typical elements of his Impressionist style with its characteristic crudeness and strength, including the architectural aspects of the composition and the boldness of the color and form. Notice how each form is reduced to its essential elements. This is like sort of a dreamlike landscape with this lone figure of an indeterminate sex. The figure, which seems to be gliding along the beach, has this small body with this large greenish head that seems to be reflecting the light from the sea. This large head and this simple form of the face is reminiscent of African masks, which in various African cultures communicated certain symbolic and spiritual meanings. African art inspired many of the German Expressionists, as well as other European art movements such as the Cubists. Aside from the brown dunes in the distance and the white of the stylized crest waves in the lower corner, the colors are arbitrary, and they have this juxtaposed positioning of large areas of cherry red and green. The subject, which is fundamental to the German Expressionist, is man and nature. The figure seems self-conscious and distressingly aware of his own or her own isolation. Rutloff achieves a sense of the transcendental. The gaze and the gesture of the mysterious figure seems to beckon the viewer. But the figure's eyes, one black, the other brownish red, look inward to a world that seems far beyond the viewer's reach. This is a highly spiritual painting meant to cause reflection about our own humanity and our own place in the physical, the natural, and the supernatural world. Any questions, Christine?
Oh, one of our viewers, our studio artist, Byron, says he relates this painting to his travels through Europe when he was a young man and is finding a personal meaning in this painting because of his memories.
Which is exactly what expressionist art is supposed to invoke. Someone's own personal, emotional, inward feelings.
Mm-hmm. And another viewer said it reminds them of Easter Island.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, you know what? I can see that in the background. Kimmy, can you point to the dunes area to the upper right? Because those figures can be interpreted as the sculptures on Easter Island, not the people, but on the very, very corner to the right. So I understand why someone could say that.
And I remember when I was reading about this, Schmidt Rutloff, he was on the sea in Germany when he painted this.
Yes, in 1919, in that year. He started in the summer. As I mentioned, he typically went to the North German sea coast because he found inspiration there. And he started the painting the summer of 1919, and he finished it in the fall.
Okay, thank you. I think we have some exclamations of being astonished by this painting. One of the viewers is just gives us a bunch of exclamation marks. So I think it's a big hit.
Well, it's in person. It really is dramatic, and really, I think all of these. Gabby, wouldn't you agree that all these paintings, when you get into that room, just pop. The colors and the forms are just incredible.
Yeah, it's stunning. It really is stunning. It's a small gallery, but stunning.
Gabby?
Good.
Next slide, please.
Yeah, thank you. So that's another favorite of mine. I think a favorite of yours as well, right, Ray? Right?
It is really one of my favorites. It is.
Yeah. So Animals in a Landscape, painted by Franz Mark in 1914. So Franz Mark was born 1880 in Munich, and he was, as Ray mentioned at the beginning, he was a key figure of the group Der Blaue Reiter. So together with Wassily Kandinsky, about whom we are going to hear later, and August Macke. I think of August Macke, we only have a drawing. I shouldn't say only, but we have a drawing, but no oil painting. It's also a well-known figure of the movement. So Mark attended the Academy of Fine Arts in Munich and received a formal training as a painter. And he also spent some time in Paris, where he studied and copied the old masters. He dove deep into Paris artistic life and got to know the avant-garde of the art world of the time. So in Animals in a Landscape, Mark was concerned with representing the spirit and the beauty of animals. So in general, he felt drawn to nature and demonstrated empathy with the creatures. And much of his work is really inspired by nature and simple life. Ray, how many animals can we see? I know we talked about this before, right?
Yeah, well, actually, it's us docents, when we have children particularly, we like to ask them, how many animals do they see? Gabby, I've only found 3, but the children's imaginations, they're able to find many more.
Yeah, and I wouldn't be surprised if there is like the 4th or 5th is somewhere.
Yeah, you know how
don't see it.
You know how children can be more perceptive sometimes.
Exactly. Yeah. So his depiction of the animals used colors, shapes, and lines in a way that hadn't been seen before. So he really broke with the traditional way nature was presented in art, and using also, like thinking back of Kirchner, consistently primary colors and then simplified cubist shapes. Cubist shapes, thinking his time in Paris, he had met, of course, or seen the art of Picasso and Braque, right? So, and again, thanks to their correspondence and entries in their journals and diaries, we know a lot about the thinking of the painters of the time. So he writes himself about the meaning of the colors. And he says, blue is a male principle, stern and spiritual. Yellow, the female principle, gentle, cheerful, and sensual. Red is matter, brutal and heavy, and always the color that must be fought and vanquished by the other two. So, and he wrote that to his friend, August Macke, whom I mentioned before, in 1910. So, and it is really the colors and the shapes that make his art today so iconic. And, Franz Mark's life is really most tragic. So I could say that about, I think, all the painters who I'm going to present today. But, for Mark, it's really especially true. He had volunteered in 1914 for frontline duty, and he also enthusiastically believed in the cathartic experience of the war. And he was hoping for a better, purer society. I think maybe we can get an idea, with all the animals that he's painting. So he was really believing more in, the goodness of animals than in like human nature. So he served in the same regiment as our William Valentina, whom we have mentioned so many times already. He was not yet the director of the DIA, but an influential museum advisor. So Mark introduced Valentina to this new and exciting art movement in Germany. So now to the tragic part. 1916, the German headquarters had drawn up a list of well-known artists to be withdrawn from combat. So Franz Mark, he was on that list, but the order did not reach him in time. Mark died on March 4th, 1916 in the Battle of Verdun. It was one of the longest and deadliest battles in the First World War, in which about 300,000 soldiers, French and German, lost their lives. Franz Mark was 36 years old. Christine, are there any questions about this painting?
No, thank you, Gabby. It's such a shame that such a talented man was taken so early.
Yeah, there he is. He's painted here by August Macke. I mentioned him a few times. That is the one to whom he wrote his letter. So they were closely connected.
And he was part of the Blue Riders.
Mm-hmm.
Or
I said Blaue Reiter, Blue Rider. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Blaue Reiter. Mm-hmm. I think Americans oftentimes learn it as Blue Rider.
That's fine. Absolutely.
If they don't understand German, but it can be interpreted either way.
And Mark was essential in founding the Blaue Reiter together with Kandinsky. And then that is so why was it called Blaue Reiter? And we don't even know it for sure. We just know there's a remark that Kandinsky said at one point, Franz Mark and I, Wassily Kandinsky, we both liked the color blue, and we both, he liked horses and I liked riders. That's how we agreed on the name.
Yeah, well, it's fascinating to learn. And we're not talking about August Macke today, but the world lost him in the war as well, correct?
Exactly. He died young as well, yes.
So unfortunately, this great group of artists, we lost many of them early in the war.
We did.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, next slide, please. This is Oskar Kokuska. He was born in Austria in 1886. Kokushka grew up in Vienna. He was educated at the Vienna School of Arts and Crafts, where he cultivated his imagination through painting, drawing, poetry, and even playwriting. In fact, in 1909, a play he wrote about the eternal conflict between men and women elicited such a hostile reaction that he was forced to leave Vienna and ended up as an illustrator in Berlin. Kokushka volunteered for the German military in the beginning of the World War I. After being critically wounded in 1917, the artist moved to Dresden to recuperate. Kokushka had a severe emotional crisis during the first several months in Dresden, and his art reflected his emotional turmoil. But in 1919, Kokushka was appointed to a professorship at the Dresden Academy. Experiencing the stability and the enjoyment of teaching greatly improved his mental health. The joy of the beauty of nature replaced the psychological anguish in his art. Next slide, please. His works of art, and here are two of them we're going to discuss, became more objective and deliberate. He turned to the saturated use of the bridge movement, and his colors became strong and luminous. He was particularly influenced by the bridge painter Emil Nolde, who we'll be discussing later. In 1938, he fled the Nazi Party persecution by moving to London, and then after World War II, he settled in Switzerland, where he lived out his life. Next slide, please, Kimmy. This is Elbe near Dresden. This is the most famous of several magnificent river landscapes that Kokushka painted in the early 1920s. The subject is of the Dresden on the banks it's the view of the Elbe River in Dresden from the artist's studio at the Dresden Academy. And this painting and these views, it's not a very big painting. It's not even 30 inches tall, and it's not even 3 feet wide. But the glowing patches of color, dominated by these bright tones of red and green and blue, make the pieces look like sparkling mosaic. It really does. I mentioned that these paintings pop, but there's this incredible jewel-like quality to this painting. Next slide, please. So Kokushka's use of those bold colors and thickly applied paint to build these patch-like forms and shapes seem inspired both by Van Gogh's use of intense colors, but Cezanne's use of form and lack of perspective. Notice Cezanne, these are both DIA paintings. Cezanne's painting to our right, you don't see as much of the brushstroke as you see patches or forms of color. And Kokushka was very much influenced by that. Next slide, please. So this painting has a mysterious quality of being both pleasing and satisfying, yet bold in color and form. The composition has a pictorial order and harmony. The painting is divided into 3 bands, which is a very common composition in landscape painting. On the foreground, you have, in this case, water. Then you'll have a middle band, which is typically the land. And then you'll have the top band, which is typically a rendition of the sky. For Kokushka, in this painting, each band separately and together seems to have perfect balance, which is enlivened by the asymmetrical church tower breaking through the line of the clustered buildings. At Valentin's direction, the museum purchased this painting directly from Kokushka shortly after he finished it. And the DIA was the first American museum to acquire one of the Kokushka's works. Just as I mentioned, it was the first to acquire Beckmann's work and many of others of these artists. Next slide, please. This is Girl with a Doll that was done around the same time. It's slightly bigger painting. It's 44 inches tall and 40 inches wide. But this also demonstrates the artist's methodical and deliberate application of the paint. You have these rough edge patches of paint that recall that rich texture of maybe a tapestry. The girl is formed by these broad areas of paint integrated into a flat patterned surface. Most striking are the unexpected vivid colors. There are glaring and challenging contrasts of blue, yellow, red, highlighted with brilliant green and ochre and brown. This is not an introspective portrait, but an exploration of the treatment of the pictorial elements for their own sake. Unlike a typical portrait of the subject matter, this is not a gentle little girl with her doll, but this girl has attitude. All sentimental and introspective qualities have been avoided, as bold colors and rigorous design lend the girl a certain robustness. Any questions, Christine?
No, not right now, Ray. And for time's sake, since we only have about 10 minutes left, I think we could move on. Gabby?
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Paula Modersohn-Becker, Old Peasant Woman from 1905. So this painting is one of the most famous and most important works by Modersohn-Becker. And it has been painted by her in Worpswede. Worpswede was, or rather is, a sleepy village in northern Germany and turned into an artist colony. So many artists of that time sought refuge in Worpswede, turning their back to the chaos of the industrial city. So looking at our Old Peasant Woman, harmony, is one of my first notions. Harmony in color, harmony in forms. And this picture really radiates strength, calmness, and quiet dignity to the viewer. So the Old Peasant Woman, she crosses her hands over her chest, and not only in art history, a gesture of acceptance. So what does she accept? She accepts the hard work that she has done in her life. So look at the dirt underneath her fingernails. She accepts her past and her future. Look at her heavy-lidded eyes gazing, so to say, beyond time and space. She accepts the course of the seasons and what nature brings with them. So look at the ranking green-blue foliage in the background. She accepts old age and her role in the rhythm and everlasting cycle of birth and maturity and death. So that, look at the flowers, a sprig of slowly wilting flowers in her lap. She's not holding it in her hand any longer. It's now laid down. So it is evident that Paula Modersohn-Becker really admired her subject, paying her true respect. And, look at the aura that surrounds her. It's almost like a halo. If you see that, it's so much dignity. And, bear with me. Recently, I heard a poem by Rainer Maria Rilke, a contemporary and actually a friend of the painter, on the radio, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is it. And he wrote it, or actually it was published in 1923, but if you told me that he had recited it to her while she was painting it, this, I would believe it. So he says, Earth, isn't this what you want? To arise in us, invisible? Is it not your dream to enter us so holy, there is nothing left outside us to see? See, I live on what? Childhood and future are equally present. Sheer abundance of being floods my heart. So that is from Rilke. I really shortened it cruelly. He can be somewhat lengthy at times, but I found it so beautifully fitting for this painting. So who was Paula Modersohn-Becker? Who portrayed the old peasant woman with so much dignity when she was just 29 years old herself? Having grown up in a well-situated, well-cultured family, she, Paula Becker at that time, first absolved a teacher training, as a reliable means of self-support, and then continued her art education. As an artist, she too found herself drawn to the simple beauty and peacefulness of Worpswede, simple beauty of nature, right? We heard that before from Kirchner and from Mark. So, well, she went to Worpswede, where she met Otto Modersohn, with whom she became closely involved. Hence the name Modersohn-Becker. So, but then, Worpswede, well, but then there was Paris, right? And together with Clara Westhoff, a sculptor, painter, and the wife of said Rainer Maria Rilke, Paula took off for Paris, actually on New Year's Eve, 1899. You know, what a symbolic moment in time, right? Just the last day of the old century. So throughout her life, she would find herself torn between these two artistic worlds, you know, going back and forth between Paris and Worpswede, between the life of an independent artist and as the companion and then wife of Otto Modersohn. In 1907, Paula Modersohn-Becker left Paris one last time for Worpswede. She was pregnant with a child from Otto Modersohn, who had come to Paris in 1906, really hoping to renew their relationship once more, and well, obviously he succeeded, right? So Paula Modersohn-Becker died the following November, 3 weeks after she had given birth to a daughter, and Paula was just 31 years old. Supposedly, in the moment of her death, Paula said, "What a pity." In German, "Wie schade." What a pity. So is it a true quote? I don't know, but it's certainly a very fitting one, right? So in spite of her life being so short, Paula Modersohn left us over 500 paintings and close to 1,000 drawings. Here we see a photograph of her and also one of her last paintings. And look, again, flowers in the picture. She's sorting them up. She has a hand over her stomach. No, she's pregnant at the time. Also very neat detail for everyone. In Paris, you know, she had started the mummy portraits. And you know that we have one in the DIA too, right? And the mummy portraits had inspired this kind of painting. You know, you see the somewhat unusual format. Yeah. Thank you. Christine, are there any questions about Paula and her old peasant woman?
Thank you so much for your presentations today, Gabby. I know Ray is finishing up and this is your last piece, so we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure.
Thanks, Gabby. What a great job you did.
Thank you.
So this is Emil Nolde. He was born in 1867 on his father's farm in Nolde, Germany. He was actually born Emil Hansen. But later, when he resigned his position as an industrial design teacher in Switzerland at the age of 31, he went to study art in earnest and eventually ended up in Berlin and joined the Bridge group of German Expressionists. When he did so, he, like Schmidt Rutloff, changed his name to take on the name of his place of birth. So he became Emil Nolde. Even though he was a member of the Nazi Party, in the 1930s, the Nazis confiscated more than 1,000 of his works, and 30 of those works ended up in the Degenerative Art exhibition. In 1941, the Nazi Party further forbid him to paint or hold any profession. However, he secretly continued to paint watercolors, which he called non-paintings. Nolde translated many of these watercolors or non-paintings into magnificent oil paintings after World War II. After the war, Nolde enjoyed tremendous success, and the DIA has really acquired many of his works. We have an extensive collection of his works. He is considered to illustrate the intuitive character of German Expressionism. He wrote, quote, "I believe in the moon and the sun. I feel their influence. I believe there is a fire blazing in the bowels of the earth, and that it influences us mortals," end of quote. Particularly through color, Nolde gave tangible expression to his feelings, an emotional-like character to the subject matter of his paintings. Next slide, please. This is Sunflowers, which is not a very big painting, but like many of the others we've discussed, it is extraordinary when you see it in person. It was painted in 1932, and it's a metaphor. The flowers are composed of seductive colors of yellow, orange, and green, highlighted with red, which stand out boldly against the blue sky with its contrasting dark, black, and purple patches. The flowers are bent downward under the apparent weight of the seeds that are ready to be dispersed. Interesting, Nolde wrote on the stretcher of the canvas, quote, ripe sunflowers, end of quote. The individual forms of these flowers loom large, reminiscent of a close-up portrait of two old friends. Next slide, please. Many of you will have thought of Van Gogh when you saw this, and this is a Van Gogh from the Metropolitan Museum. Nolde, like Van Gogh, often painted sunflowers, responding to their simple forms and the way they simply bear deep personal feelings. Next slide, please. The DIA painting has a feeling of melancholy. Nolde loved flowers, and he identified them as a parallel to human existence, much like Renaissance or 17th century Dutch painters. He wrote, quote, I love the flowers in their fate, shooting up, blooming, glowing, decaying, and thrown away into a pit. Our own life is not always so logical and beautiful, but it always ends up in the fire or the grave, end of quote. When Nolde executed this painting, he was experiencing recurring fits of depression for over 2 years. And he was also suffering from symptoms of what was later diagnosed as stomach cancer. Doesn't this seem in this painting that Nolde is expressing his own personal despair of human mortality? Under an increasingly dark and ominous sky, the flowers droop downward toward the earth, as if they will momentarily succumb to the inevitable fate of their demise. Christine, unless there's any questions, I think that we should close today because we're a little bit over time.
Okay, Ray, for the sake of time, we will go ahead and do that. There are many comments complimenting the team today on what a great presentation and how much many viewers really liked seeing this collection. So thank you.
That sounds great, and I appreciate Gabby filling in today. She did a wonderful job. So next week we have another virtual tour that our DIA volunteer docents will be doing. It's to Diabonicus 2, Deb Combs, Kathleen McBroom, and Tana McPherson. So I encourage you to tune in again next week. It'll be a wonderful presentation. And in the meantime, stay safe.